She thought being sold was the worst thing that could happen, until she discovered what her mysterious buyer actually wanted. Here's the thing, nobody talks about when they mention the Old South debt was deadlier than bullets. While everyone focuses on the dramatic stuff, the wars, the politics, the big plantations, the real killer was quieter. It was the ledger book, the monthly payment, the promise that somehow, next season, things would get better. They never did. By the 1880s, something twisted had taken root across the South. Over half the farms were being worked by people who didn't own them, not sharecropping by choice. Mind you, these families were trapped like flies in honey, stuck to land that belonged to someone else, working crops they'd never profit from. The math was simple and brutal. Plant cotton, harvest cotton, sell cotton. Then discover you owe more than you made. Again, the landowner would pull out his book, run his finger down the columns, and shake his head. Looks like you're short this year, friend. That word friend always came with a smile that didn't reach the eyes. Poor harvests made everything worse. When the weather didn't cooperate, and it seemed like it never did when you needed it most, families found themselves drowning deeper. Cotton prices dropped like stones in a well. What sold for decent money one year might barely cover seed costs the next. But the rent, the interest, those numbers only went one direction. Then there's the part that makes your stomach turn. Children became currency. Wives became collateral. When a family couldn't pay what they owed, landowners didn't just shrug and walk away. They got creative about collection methods. A 12-year-old boy might find himself apprenticed to work off daddy's debt. A teenage daughter could be placed with another family until the books balanced. The law wasn't exactly rushing to help either. Funny how judges always seemed to see things the landowner's way. Contracts that looked reasonable on paper turned into iron shackles in court. That clause about not leaving until debts were satisfied in full, turns out those debts had a magical way of never quite reaching zero. Black families caught the worst of it, but poor white families weren't exempt from this particular nightmare. Debt didn't discriminate much when it came to squeezing people dry. Everyone was fair game if they couldn't pay. What really twisted the knife was how the system fed itself. Each bad year created more desperate families. Each desperate family meant more workers the landowners could control. More control meant they could set prices, terms, everything. It was a machine designed to create and maintain human misery. The landowners called it business. The families called it something else entirely. But here's where things get interesting. Because some people weren't content to just accept this as the natural order of things. Some folks were willing to take enormous risks to break these chains. The question wasn't whether someone would try to fight back. The question was what they'd be willing to sacrifice to do it. The debt was just the beginning. What happened next makes modern contract disputes look like playground arguments. Most land contracts included clauses that basically said, "You're not going anywhere." Farmers couldn't pack up and leave, even if they found better opportunities elsewhere. The fine print trapped entire families. Breaking these agreements meant legal trouble, and Southern courts weren't exactly known for their sympathy toward poor folks trying to escape their circumstances. But here's where it gets really dark. Young women and girls became bargaining chips. Landowners could demand them as payment, forcing them to work in fields or homes until debts were settled. They weren't employees. They were human collateral. The law treated them like property that could be transferred from one owner to another. Makes your worst job interview seem pretty reasonable, right? Black families faced the harshest treatment, but white families weren't immune either. Desperation made people do unthinkable things. Families would literally disappear in the middle of the night, abandoning everything they owned to escape impossible debt cycles. They'd travel hundreds of miles, hoping to start fresh where no one knew their names or their obligations. Then there's the family separation issue. Landowners held legal power to split up households if payments weren't made. Children could be sent to work for different owners. Husbands might be forced to labor on distant farms, while wives stayed behind to tend crops. The emotional toll was devastating, but the system didn't care about keeping families together. It cared about collecting what was owed. Livestock, crops, tools, furniture, everything became fair game for debt collection. Farmers would wake up to find their only cow being led away by strangers with legal papers. The cotton they'd spent months growing would be seized before they could sell it themselves. Even household items like cooking pots and blankets could be taken to satisfy creditors. Well, the really twisted part was how the math worked. Families would hand over valuable assets, thinking they were reducing their debt, only to discover the landowner had calculated things differently. That cow worth $50? The owner might only credit 20 toward the debt, claiming the rest covered storage fees or administrative costs. Legal protection was basically non-existent for poor farmers, especially black families in the post-Reconstruction South. Courts operated more like debt collection agencies than places where justice happened. Judges often had financial relationships with the same landowners demanding payment. The whole system was rigged from top to bottom. Some families tried creative solutions. They'd borrow from relatives, sell personal items, or take on additional work, but the contracts were designed to be inescapable. Every attempt to pay down debt seemed to generate new charges and fees. The psychological pressure was crushing. Parents watched their children go hungry while landowners lived comfortably. The shame of being unable to provide for family, combined with the constant threat of losing everything, broke many people's spirits completely. But something interesting started happening around this time. Rumors began spreading about mysterious strangers carrying unusual solutions to these impossible problems. Being trapped in debt was just the beginning. Once families signed those sharecropping contracts, landowners controlled every single aspect of their lives. What crops to plant? The owner decided. How much land to work? Not your choice. When to harvest? Better wait for permission. The math never worked in favor of the families doing the actual work. Landowners kept detailed ledgers that somehow always showed families owing more money at the end of each season. They'd charge inflated prices for seeds, tools, and basic food supplies. A bag of flour that cost 50 cents in town? That'll be $2 when you buy it from the company store. Makes sense, right? Then there's the creative accounting that would make modern tax lawyers jealous. Owners charged interest on everything families bought throughout the year. They deducted mysterious fees for land maintenance and equipment usage. Some even charged families for the privilege of living in the rundown shacks they called housing. By harvest time, a family that had worked sunup to sundown for months would discover they somehow owed more money than when they started. Well, if you thought about leaving to find better opportunities elsewhere, think again. Many contracts included clauses that essentially made it illegal to abandon your debt. Sheriffs worked closely with landowners to track down families who tried to escape. Getting caught meant jail time, physical punishment, or worse consequences for the entire family. But why didn't families just refuse to work under these conditions? Armed guards made sure that question never became a real option. Some plantations employed men whose only job was watching workers and preventing anyone from getting ideas about freedom. These guards carried guns and had legal backing from local courts that rarely questioned their methods. Southern courts operated under an unspoken rule: protect the landowners at all costs. Black families faced especially harsh treatment, but poor white sharecroppers learned quickly that skin color meant little when money was involved. Judges routinely sided with property owners in disputes, regardless of how unfair the original contracts might have been. Let's not forget the psychological warfare that kept families compliant. Landowners spread rumors about what happened to people who tried to break their contracts. Stories of families being hunted down, beaten, or having their children taken away served as powerful deterrents. Whether all these stories were true didn't matter. The fear was real enough. The strangest part? Some families genuinely believed they might eventually work their way out of debt through sheer determination. Year after year, they'd plant cotton or tobacco, hoping this would be the season that changed everything. The landowners encouraged this false hope because it kept people working without rebellion. And the weird part is, even families who managed to have good harvests rarely saw their debts decrease significantly. Somehow, market prices were always too low, or unexpected expenses appeared on the books. The system was designed to keep people trapped indefinitely. But what happened when someone showed up with enough gold to break these chains completely? That's where things got really interesting. When debt collectors showed up at your door, most families had two choices: hand over whatever they could scrape together or watch their children get taken as payment. But every once in a while, something different happened. A stranger would ride up with a leather pouch that jingled just right. Gold changed everything in an instant. These weren't your typical travelers. Some called them drifters, others knew them as cowboys or traders. What mattered wasn't their name, it was what they carried. A single bag of gold coins could wipe out debts that families had been drowning in for years. Debts that seemed impossible to escape suddenly vanished with the clink of metal on a table. Well, if you had the right connections, the math was brutal but simple. A family might owe $300 after years of failed crops and mounting interest. That same amount could fit in a small sack weighing maybe 2 pounds. 2 pounds of gold versus a lifetime of servitude. Makes sense why people took desperate risks, right? Then there were the riders who made this their business. These men understood something most people didn't. Debt slavery wasn't just morally wrong, it was also a market opportunity. Buy someone's freedom today, and they might work for you tomorrow as free people, or maybe they disappear into the night, grateful enough to never cause trouble. But here's the weird part. Some of these rescuers weren't motivated by profit at all. Former slaves who'd struck it rich out west sometimes returned with enough gold to buy entire families out of bondage. They'd ride into towns where they once picked cotton, now carrying more wealth than the plantation owners who used to whip them. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, especially the landowners who suddenly found themselves on the receiving end of cash they couldn't refuse. Violence followed these transactions more often than you'd expect. Local sheriffs didn't appreciate outsiders disrupting their economic system. Armed guards employed by landowners had orders to prevent exactly this kind of interference. A stranger with gold represented more than just one family's freedom. They threatened the entire structure that kept cheap labor trapped. Smart rescuers learned to work fast and quiet, ride in at night, negotiate quickly, and leave before dawn. The successful ones developed networks of allies, people who could provide fresh horses or safe places to sleep. Because once you bought someone's freedom, you still had to get them out alive. Many attempts failed spectacularly. Cowboys got shot before they could even reach for their gold. Others found themselves facing inflated debts that magically doubled once landowners spotted wealth. Some families refused rescue, too terrified of the consequences if they got caught trying to leave. For those lucky enough to witness a successful gold for freedom exchange, hope felt real for the first time in years. Watching someone walk away from unpayable debt in a single afternoon proved escape was possible. Yet buying freedom was just the beginning of a much longer journey, one that would test whether gold could truly erase years of suffering. Freedom came with a bill nobody expected to pay. When those sacks of gold finally settled family debts, the celebrating didn't last long. Makes sense, right? Years of being told when to wake up, what to plant, and how much you were worth don't just disappear because someone handed over some coins. The Johnsons from Alabama got their freedom in 1923. 3 generations of debt wiped clean with one payment. But freedom meant starting over at age 45 with absolutely nothing except the clothes they wore. No tools, no seeds, no place to call home. The landowner who'd controlled their lives for decades suddenly acted like they'd never existed. "You're free to go," he said, as if that solved everything. Well, where exactly were they supposed to go? Many families discovered that escaping debt slavery meant entering a different kind of prison. They had no credit, no references, and no connections outside the plantation system. Former sharecroppers found themselves competing for jobs with people who'd never been trapped in the first place. The weird part is, some families actually missed having guaranteed shelter and food, even under horrible conditions. Then there's the psychological toll nobody talks about. Children who'd watched their parents get beaten for asking questions grew up afraid to speak their minds. Women who'd been sold like livestock struggled to trust anyone, even their own rescuers. Men who'd worked fields they'd never owned couldn't figure out how to make decisions for themselves. But some families got smart about their newfound freedom. They pooled resources with other escaped families, creating their own communities far from old plantation lands. The Washingtons moved to Detroit and started a small business. The O'Briens headed west to California, where nobody knew their history. Distance became their best friend. Let's not forget the families who stayed and fought back. Some used their freedom to help others still trapped in debt. They'd return secretly, sharing information about job opportunities up north or warning about which landowners were the most dangerous. These underground networks saved thousands of lives, though you won't find them in most history books. The real game changer came after World War II. Mechanization hit southern agriculture like a tornado. Machines could do the work of 20 people, and they never complained or tried to escape. Suddenly, keeping families in debt slavery became more expensive than just buying tractors. Economic forces accomplished what moral arguments couldn't. And the weird part is, some former landowners went broke too. Without cheap labor, many couldn't compete with larger farms using modern equipment. The system that had made them rich for generations collapsed almost overnight. By the 1950s, most debt slavery had disappeared from the South. Legal changes helped, but technology killed it faster than any law could. The families who survived carried stories that would echo through generations. Stories of terror, yes, but also stories of hope and the strangers with gold who proved that freedom, however expensive, was always worth the price. Those memories shaped entire communities and reminded everyone that liberty sometimes arrives in the most unexpected ways.